Welcome back to Let's Talk About Human Rights show. I'm your host, Jules Allender, with the California chapter of Youth for Human Rights International. This is a show where we talk all things human rights, and specifically the 30 human rights out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in today's show, we're specifically going to be talking about human right number 3, the right to life. And that states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And we have a guest today whom we're going to be speaking about that specifically, but before we get into that, let's look at some statistics on traffic safety. This comes from the National Center for Health Statistics mortality data. 40,000 traffic deaths a year in this country, and millions more are injured. Of the 1,089 bicyclist deaths in 2019, 712 died in motor vehicle crashes and 377 in other incidents. Males accounted for 88% of all bicycle deaths, over 7 times the fatalities for females. The National Center for Health Statistics estimates 7,668 pedestrians died in traffic or non-traffic incidents in 2019. Non-traffic incidents occur on non-traffic ways such as driveways, parking lots, or other private property. The latest data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that in 2019, 6,205 pedestrians died in traffic crashes occurring on public roads. And I'm incredibly honored and looking forward to speaking with our guest today on her work that she's doing with her organization in traffic and traffic safety and road safety. But again, first let's look at some human rights good news. And this is a great story coming out of Vancouver. A new supermarket opened out there specifically to get unwanted food and produce into the hands of people who need or want it, sparing it from being dumped into landfills. There's an organization called Food Stash Foundation. There's an organization called Food Stash Foundation's, quote, rescued food markets, unquote. And it opened its doors on October 1st. And their surplus produce and food is available to anyone, whether they're food insecure, looking to reduce their environmental impact, or simply need to cut down on grocery costs and pay what you feel basis. And this is something that I learned, there's an enormous amount of CO2 which is generated every year around the world from food decaying in landfills. And by rescuing it, that organization is not only saving money, but they're saving the planet and getting food to those who otherwise may not have been able to afford it. So we always love to see good news, especially when it's helping the environment and the individuals. And now for our section on youth in the news. It's a story of a young boy who's raising money to help children in need to get presents for Christmas. This young man's name is Jackson Turner, and he's raised $5,900 through GoFundMe and social media to supply kids in the need of new sneakers, coats, socks, toys, and a hot meal for the holidays. And this is a quote straight from Jackson, and he says, "I think we need to help them because so many families during this pandemic are losing their jobs or their houses, and moms are already worrying about being homeless. Why should they worry about Christmas for their children too?" This is Jackson's 3rd year setting up the Christmas event for a shelter in McKinney, Texas, under his nonprofit called Never Too Young to Care. One mother whom Jackson has helped last year said that her 4 children had never received brand new shoes until he arranged for them to have some. And again, yes, you are really never too young to care about others. And that's just a great, heartwarming story about Jackson Turner out in Texas. All right, and so again, for today's show, we're going to be talking about specifically human right number 3, the right to life. And let's go ahead and take a look at that PSA.
It greeted you at birth. that was there for your first step, your first mistake, your first kiss. It's with you when you win, when you lose, when you pick yourself up again. In every moment, you can feel it. Life. Human right number 3, the right to life. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org.
That has always been one of my favorite PSAs out of all 30 of the PSAs that they've done. So with that, being able to live in some level of safety, whether it just be walking down the street, riding your bike, or the food we eat, is a basic right. People should not be put into a position where their life is in danger because of others' actions. This can be a slippery slope, as when you live in a free society, you don't want to go around threatening everyone who is alive because something could go wrong. But things like following well-researched safety regulations for driving in residential areas or not being sold tainted food is a right that properly belongs under the heading, the right to life. We all have the right to life and to live in freedom and safety. And today's program is specifically about safety. And with that, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Leah Shahum. And we're excited to talk to you about your dedication and hard work to make the roads safer. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Jules. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So first, let's talk about you. You've spent many years of your life in this area. Why are you so passionate about traffic safety?
Yeah, I think I see it as one of those areas that truly affects everyone. Like so many of the important issues that you talked about in the introduction here, you know, everyone needs to get somewhere, whether that's to school, to work, to the grocery store, to the playground, to the market, you know, everywhere they need to go. And just like we hope that everyone has clean air to breathe, clean drinking water to drink, you know, access to the real basics of a healthy, safe life. We've really seen too often this idea of safe mobility has been overlooked. I think a lot of people around the world, and certainly in the US, have become dangerously complacent to the huge number of traffic deaths and severe injuries. So we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. I think I've just really been, as someone who does really appreciate and enjoy walking and bicycling, taking transit, and occasionally driving, have really felt how threatening that can be. And want to help make that safe and comfortable for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. And I can also attest to, you know, sometimes walking my dogs or riding my bike with my dogs, and these people, you just go, oh my gosh. You know, it's startling that, to me, that there's no consideration for what could go wrong, right? Obviously, I don't live my life in the idea that things are going to go wrong all the time, but like you're saying, right, having just, you know, simple safety precautions, not driving 150 miles an hour down a residential street, you know, it's just senseless acts and senseless deaths that can result for this. So that's great that we have individuals who are passionate about this and keeping our right to life, you know, more on our own terms and not based on someone else's senseless actions.
That's right. And a lot of what we're doing with our efforts of Vision Zero, the goal of zero traffic deaths, is really looking at the systems we're moving about in. So really thinking about moving beyond the individual choices. I mean, that's certainly important, right? We need to educate people to do the right thing, but also acknowledging people make mistakes. Mm-hmm. There are going to be, you know, whether that's the sun in your eyes at a bad moment, and you make a mistake, or, you know, a child who may not understand the rules of the road, or whatever the situation. Really, we're focused on how do we design systems that recognize that people are fallible, we're going to make mistakes. So let's make sure that the system is forgiving. And that really comes down to a lot of things that we can design, right? These traffic deaths and injuries, they're not inevitable. They are preventable. And a lot of that has to do with prioritizing safety. So redesigning roads literally so that they are a little bit slower. It's important to say, okay, speed is not as important as safety. Safety is more important than speed. So yeah, we're going to redesign the road. We're going to lower speed limits. We're going to change the design or regulate the design of vehicles, cars, so that they are safer and slower. We're going to give more space to people walking and biking. So what I get really excited about is really trying to think upstream to how do we address systems that are actually built in ways and are running in ways that are dangerous.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense, it just makes sense. I'm curious, and I just had this thought, what are your thoughts, right? So Tesla's come out with my understanding is a self-driving car. Is that correct? Thoughts?
That's interesting. I definitely am not an expert, I want to say, in the self-driving autonomous vehicle world, though I've been trying to learn more. And as you probably know, and your viewers know, there's a lot of that happening, particularly in California. I think many of our areas are kind of the hotbed for this technology. We are trying to understand better. There's certainly, and this isn't about Tesla in particular, but about autonomous vehicles, there's certainly potential there, right? As the vehicle makers, the autonomous vehicle makers say, this car, if designed right, never gets drowsy, it doesn't drive drunk, it doesn't get distracted. So one could say, okay, yeah, that you could take the quote unquote human error out. That sounds great in concept, and I hope that's the case. I think a lot of us still have concerns about still someone's programming that vehicle, right? Yeah. There's still human decision making there. So, what does that mean? How do they recognize people walking? How does it make a decision between safety of this or this, the person inside the car, the person outside the car? And frankly, just to be blunt, it's still another car on the road taking up precious public space. And, when there are crashes, and there will be, it's still a, dangerous sized vehicle. So I don't think we should believe that these autonomous vehicles are a panacea. I think we really need to be focusing on what we can do now, and then how do we fit technology into our safety priorities versus the other way around.
For sure. It's just as you were talking, I just had that thought. And, to your point, right, my question goes, well, what if, what happens if it's short? Because my phone crashes, my computer will stop working suddenly, and I go back to all I could think of sometimes is like in Star Wars, right, where we're talking ancient technology, right, R2-D2 or what, has a short, and you go, what happens if that car is driving on the freeway and it has a short? Because it's bound to happen at some point in time. That's that's just my opinion on it.
No, I think you're right, and I think it also, frankly, looking ahead to this technology in a way, or focusing on the technology, it kind of lets us off the hook societally for what's happening right now, right? And it's today, on the average day in the US, an estimated 117 people will die today. And those, people of all walks of life, from all sorts of people, they'll die walking, biking, driving, on a scooter, on a scoot board, or skateboard, and these are preventable traffic deaths. And just to share a bit more of the numbers, I think you shared some of those high level numbers. This really shocked me. I found this out a few years ago. It's been the case, sadly, for a while, but internationally and in the US, youth and young adults, the leading cause of death of youth and young adults are traffic crashes. That's the way more young people are dying in our country and in the world than any other way. And you look and you say, okay, well, gosh, we're responding to certain public health crises, obviously right now with the coronavirus pandemic, and we need to, of course, yet to say, wow, year after year after year, more young people are dying in car crashes or because of vehicle crashes than any other way. What are we doing to change that? Yeah. And I think our challenge has been that, again, I think we've become too complacent and think, oh, this is just how it has to be. This is a unfortunate but unavoidable cost of modern society. And it isn't. It doesn't have to be. There's a lot of, particularly, frankly, developing nations that are way ahead on traffic safety because they've designed systems differently. And sadly, around the world, it's particularly low and middle income nations that have the highest rates of traffic deaths because they're not don't have the funds to put in to the safety work, and frankly that certain countries are shipping the dangerous cars there. I mean, there's a real, unfortunately, systemic problem to this that goes far beyond an individual's behavior.
Yeah, definitely. It's it'd be nice to give, how do I say this? Not like-minded, but someone on the same scale attention to other crises as you're talking about that can lower accidental deaths, as we are seeing what we're going through currently. That's my opinion on that. And then you talked about, so there are countries that have extremely low traffic deaths. Is that what you said? And what countries are those and why?
It's interesting. Some of the places that really stand out are places like Sweden, the Netherlands, the UK. Now I want to pause and say, I know those are small countries. I know they are wealthy, relatively, wealthy nations compared to many in the world. So I do want to caveat that. What we've seen that I think is really important, and let me just compare compare the US. I'll start with Sweden because it's one of the safest, and it's actually where this concept of Vision Zero started, the goal of zero traffic deaths. So in Sweden, last I looked, about within the last year, their traffic death rate was around roughly 3 people per 100,000 people living there. In the US, we are above 12 people per 100,000. So, I know it's apples and oranges, a small country, a big country, but when you look at the traffic death rate, and then I want to pause and say, it hasn't always been that way. Because a lot of people say, oh, that's the culture. We're different. We love this and we love that. True, we're different. That said, it hasn't always been this way. So when you go back, really back to kind of the 40s, 50s, 60s, I think even into the 70s, it started to change in the 70s, but go back to say the 1950s, 60s, our countries, the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, we were all quite similar in our traffic death rate. And then beginning in the 70s and much more in the 80s, there were a lot of technology or in-car improvements, things like seatbelts. It sounds, kind of old-fashioned today, right? But seatbelts, and then things like airbags. And so there was more and more safety technology and requirements. So interestingly, we all got a little better. If you look at a graph, most countries got a little better safety-wise because of those things, noticeably better. And then the countries I mentioned, like Sweden and the UK, kept getting better because they were investing in this systemic safety that I mentioned, real systems level. Meanwhile, the US, we flattened and then started dropping, and we've been dropping. Unfortunately, I can talk about that a lot in the last year and a half. And that's partly because we've been very good, better and better about making those inside the car safer. Again, airbags, seatbelts, that's important. That is great. We have not done much to help people outside the vehicles be safe. And we see that dramatically, tragically high traffic death rates for people walking and biking because, again, it's partly because people feel more a sense of, it's good to feel a sense of safety in the car, but people feel a sense of almost, inevitable, like, oh, I can do anything. So you see people driving faster. You see vehicles, frankly, getting bigger. The big vehicles are more dangerous, as you can imagine. They're just heavier and bigger. So we're really seeing this divergence of who kind of has the right to safety or given the right to safety and who isn't in our communities. And I think it's worth mentioning and very important. I've talked more about people walking and biking, talked about children. They are all at disproportionate risks of being hit, injured, and killed, as are senior citizens because they're more frail and often a little bit maybe more slow to move in traffic. The other communities we know are disproportionately impacted, meaning injured and killed in our country, are people in low-income communities and people in communities of color. And there's a real correlation there because, unfortunately, when you look and say, okay, where are our most dangerous roads? Where are the high-speed roads and the freeway touchdowns? Where are we lacking sidewalks, et cetera? These are predominantly, or disproportionately, I should say, disproportionately in low-income and communities of color. So this has nothing to do with the individuals. It has to do with the circumstances of what's been really built through their neighborhoods. So it's a real systemic and I would say particularly a racist issue within our transportation system that's causing this serious health crisis.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have a few questions on what you said. So in Sweden, you talked about, so I know you said 3 in 100,000, but what specifically are they doing differently from the US that is allowing that low death rate?
Yeah, great question. And I was really fortunate. I got to go study for a few months and really go deep into Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany and understand and learn about what they were doing differently. I want to know, because I know I'm talking a lot about
You're fine.
Very European notion, European, predominantly white, wealthy nations. I just want to note real quickly that other places are in adopting Vision Zero and seeing real progress. They're not as far along as those places, but examples are Mexico City, huge and very populated, obviously, and dense city. So Mexico City and also Colombia, Bogota have both adopted Vision Zero and are seeing real safety improvements. So what are those cities and countries doing differently? Great question. There's a couple big things. I'd say the three big things that they point to across the board. Number one, slowing speeds down.
Okay.
So especially when you have a mix of uses, right? It's one thing to be on a freeway with lots of cars moving at freeway speeds. That's one situation. But a lot of us are in cities or suburbs or maybe small towns with a town center. So if you have people walking and biking and waiting for the bus, and you also have car traffic moving through, those high speeds just don't mix. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what they're doing is bringing the speeds down by lowering speed limits, by redesigning roads so that drivers are forced to slow down. There's a lot more physical design of the streets to slow down. And in some places using automated safety cameras or speed cameras, which I know, people don't love those because they don't want to get tickets, but it sure is effective in slowing people down. So that speed management's key. And then really, really designing the roads to be complete streets. And again, I'm talking about more cities, suburbs,
sure,
areas where people are walking and biking, but to say, hey, on every street, you've got to have full good sidewalks. You've got to have crosswalks that are not a mile apart. Because you know what, when it's a whole mile, people aren't going to, they're not going to wait. If they see a bus stop and they need to catch the bus, they're going to run across the street. Right. And that can be dangerous without a good, safe crosswalk, right? So build the infrastructure so that safety is easy, right? The safe choice is the easy choice, the obvious choice. And then thirdly, really thinking about how to design the vehicles differently. I've been really shocked to learn, maybe not shocked, but disappointed to learn that places, again, like Europe, I know I'm pointing to Europe a lot, but places like Europe have many more regulations of safety in the car. Things like speed monitors so that, the speed is controlled in a certain environment. Things like pedestrian detectors on the vehicles, the cars. We don't require those things in the US, but we could. So we're far behind the leading safety nations in what we could be doing on our streets, in our policies, and in our vehicle regulation.
Yeah, it's like I had mentioned before, it's that fine line between, we live in this free society, right? And we don't really want so many rules and regulations. Obviously, we do need to have some, or else, it would just kind of be too wild. And so, yeah, I mean, those points are valid. I have a speed sensor on my car that I set to a certain speed. So you go, whoa, okay. Sometimes you'll be driving, and you kind of zone out, unfortunately. And it's like, dee dee dee. I'm like, oh, okay. And if I think the ultimate solution, right, is that the individual driving the car in the vehicle is the responsible, is the, aware, is going to have the forethought to understand where they are, so that we don't have to have all these rules and regulations. But I do think, I don't necessarily disagree with you that some couldn't be of benefit. And it's interesting about the sidewalks. I noticed this about a year and a half ago, that in the downtown area in the city I live, they took the bike lane and instead of it being next to the cars, where the cars that were going, the lanes, they took to the area where parked cars go and they moved them about 8 feet from the sidewalk, and now the bike lane is between the parked cars and the sidewalk, and so they're not directly near the traffic. And it's like it threw me off at first, right? Because you're just not used to it. You're like, oh my God, what are all these parked cars doing on my road? And then you go, oh my gosh, that seems logical. Like, let's take that danger out. It's something we can easily do. Hopefully people don't get clipped while they're getting in the car, right? There's obviously going to be something. But to your point, I thought of that as you were talking. I was like, oh yeah, that's probably what they were doing.
It's a great example. And a lot of times it is, it's about different design, geometry on the street. How do we make sure there is dedicated safe space for all the road users? And nobody in their right mind wants to be, hitting someone else or hit, obviously, but sometimes the street design and the layout just doesn't make it safe. So again, it's really about how are we designing for safe mobility for everybody, and for that to be the easy thing, the obvious choice.
Right.
And a lot of that does come down to speed and separated space.
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. And so I know it can seem far-fetched, but as a human rights advocate, I have to ask, how easy is it for you to correlate this basic human right of safety to traffic safety?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of, it's very fundamental. I think, for the work we do, it's about, it's death prevention, right? It's injury prevention. So at the very core, it's how do I help keep myself alive and whole and safe? At the same time, it's very much related to access to other areas of life that are very much related to health, right? So the ability to be active, for those that can be active, walking and biking. We know that, along with the traffic death numbers that we've been citing, right, that are astronomical, we also know there's a huge number of people, and again, unfortunately, it's particularly vulnerable communities who have high rates of asthma, diabetes, heart disease, other very serious illnesses that relate to inactivity, not fully that, but partly by being physically inactive. So we know, gosh, looking back, 40 years ago, many more kids walked to school and biked to school.
Right.
Go back 80 years and probably all the kids walked and biked to school, right? And today that's very uncommon for a lot of reasons. And for a lot of reasons, kids aren't getting the exercise they need regularly and just making that part of their childhood.
Right.
And not just about the health of it. There's certainly health of it, but that sense of freedom, right? I mean, as a kid, you need to be, I think, be able to go out and explore and find your own independence in that way. And too often we've built communities where kids need to be they need to be shuttled around by their parents all the time, and they don't have that independence, and that's not ideal, right? And then you look, okay, who's doing that shuttling around? When you look at the numbers, it's predominantly women. It's the women in the family who are doing the grocery shopping, carrying the kids here and there, and shuttling to soccer practice and school, etc. And that's taking up a huge amount of their time and their capacity to be doing other things. There's just so much, and then you pause and think about, obviously, the environmental harms of the system we've built with far too much traffic. We know transportation is the number one cause of pollutants in the air, and obviously major cause of climate change. So, thinking about kind of safety in the sense of safety of the planet, safety of communities, safety of children, it really comes back to that kind of core health and preserving your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. Safety of person, right? That's my right. My right is I have the right to life, liberty, and the safety of my person, so it fits right in. And, I think safety is an easy idea to agree with, right? Wouldn't you say?
I do. And then the devil gets in the details, right? When you start like, everyone, whenever I talk about Vision Zero, the goal of zero traffic deaths, well, who's against it, right? Again, nobody probably with their right mind is against it. But then you start talking about, well, how do we get there? We're going to lower the speeds. We're going to change this street. We're going to encourage more people to do this, and this. We're going to make it a little harder. Of course, there's carrots and sticks with any change, right? But it's
right.
People start to fall off when you actually say that they're going to need to change their own habits or their own, traditions. And that's the hardest part of our job, is how do you help people, kind of get over that fear of change, accept that we're all part of the same ecosystem, that we need to, commit to be part of the solution as well.
Yeah, you brought up a memory that I had. Growing up, we lived on this. It is a little bit of a thoroughway. I mean, it's a residential street, but people would cut through to beat traffic, and it was a long street. There's a stretch where there was no stop sign, and people would just come, flying down. And so my dad actually advocated and went to the city and tried to get all the neighbors to put in speed bumps to slow people down. I mean, at that point, my brother and I were both grown and out of the house, but there was a lot of young families around them, and the neighbors wouldn't, it's amazing that they, like you're saying, they wouldn't go into action. So to your point, yeah, everyone can agree with it, but then, what does it take? Who are you going to make mad? What arguments are you going to run into? And can you continue to push to get to the destination that is probably the best? I mean, speed bumps need to go on that street. I mean, it's just people go freaking 50 miles an hour down that road. You go, oh my gosh.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's why do some families have to deal with that? Some kids' mobility and potential play and friend, it changes the way they not just interact with each other, but you look back and go, oh yeah, friends from the neighborhood. Do they really get the chance to develop real friendships playing out on the street, playing stickball or whatever it is? So kudos to your dad for trying that.
Yeah.
And hopefully lots more will be inspired and keep doing that. Because, it does, as much as I'm talking about kind of these top-down solutions of, let's redesign the streets, let's set speed limits. Those are important things. It also takes individuals, it takes community members saying, this isn't right. I want safety for not just me, but the whole neighborhood, for everyone here. And it's not okay for people to just cut through our neighborhood, So how do we think about, again, that greater good of safety?
Yeah, absolutely. And so staying along the lines of the human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if this was more broadly understood and accepted, do you think you could get your message through more easily?
I do. I think there's this complacency around traffic deaths that it's not generally viewed as a public health crisis, which it is, given the numbers, and it's not viewed enough or understood enough as something that we have agency over, and we do have agency over it. And I want to mention, because I was very excited to be part of, back in 2019, early 2019, I was part of an international global conference on road safety. And it was really exciting. This is the third such global event they have, organized by the United Nations. And part of the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN is this target around safe mobility. And they set the goal back in 2019 when I was there to internationally, globally, cut in half the number of traffic deaths from the year 2020 to the year 2030. Very ambitious, very ambitious. And they really tie this together, obviously, to preventing preventable deaths, stopping preventable deaths, but really connected it to, obviously, climate action, but also things like sustainable cities, reduced inequalities overall from a cost and access perspective, to gender equality. Like I mentioned, thinking about who's bearing the brunt of certain types of trips, to general health and well-being and education access and all of these good things. So I do think, there's some folks who do get the, obviously understand the connections, but I would say for kind of our local elected leaders or state, or for our leaders in the US, I think there's a real short-term thinking about things, right? Of like, okay, what do I get done in my 4 years or my 8 years? And the kind of change we're talking about with this, right, has been, it is big. It's culture change. It's shifting our environment, but it's got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
We've got to be able to, and that's what we're trying to do with Vision Zero, is say, okay, who amongst you, who that we're talking with, if you really want the goal of zero, okay, here are the things we're going to have to do. They're big, they're transformative, they're going to make some people uncomfortable, they are change, they're going to get pushback. And somebody says, well, okay, well, maybe not zero. Let's just make it a little safer. Let's make it, half as safe, or whatever the word is. Like, okay, whose family members are those then on the losing end of that? It's someone's, right? It's someone's child or mother or coworker. So really thinking about, I'd say one thing we're trying to do, to your point, is, how do we help people kind of shake off the complacency is we're teaming with wonderful people and amazing, brave people who've been involved. They've been victims of traffic crashes or tragically lost loved ones in a crash. And these are groups like Members of Families for Safe Streets and others that are organizing. Actually, there's one in Southern California, there's a chapter in Southern California, a chapter in Northern California, and at least another dozen across the country. This started in New York City, where it's people banding together saying enough is enough. I've lost someone, I've been injured. And they're really willing to step up and tell their stories and put a name and a face and a story with these tragic numbers. So I'm hopeful this will help turn the tide of change.
Yeah, it's, almost like drugs, right? Not everyone, but, it's not an issue, it's not an issue, it's not an issue until it happens to a loved one, until it's that mom, until it's that friend, until they end up on the street, until they OD, until they commit suicide because they can't get off of it, that it becomes, now it's an important issue, right? That's kind of how I viewed that also when you're talking about, well, it is someone's loved ones. I mean, it is someone's child who died senselessly and at the hands of someone else, basically, So, yeah, it's great what you guys are doing. I think a lot more awareness around this topic and around my safety of person as my right needs to become, much more well known and much more accepted, and individuals need to continue to fight for that. And so we ask this of every guest as we get near the end of the interview. And my question is what is your favorite human right and why?
Wow. Oh my goodness. That's really big. I think, gosh, hard to pick one, right?
Yeah, I agree.
The work I'm doing, I'd say those that are, related to, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to move about, right? I mean, that means many more things, of course,
sure.
Politically, but that idea of being able to move where you want to, do what you want to, physically, but that is, in the video you showed, that freedom to assemble, just like what a reminder that, that's physically and symbolically obviously so important. But if we can't keep safe kind of moving our own bodies around in this shared public space, what else is there? So I will choose that.
Yeah, there's isolation, which none of us want, right? So, yeah, I agree. I love it. And so thank you so much for being on the show and doing what you do and continue to do what you do. And, I appreciate you sharing your story and your Vision Zero, which I am definitely on board with.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It is interesting to take a subject like traffic safety and see how it plays a part in such important documents as the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. We can look at all these rights as huge and impressive, but they can also be pared down to everyday things, and then we see how encompassing our rights are to quality of life. So thank you again to Leah for being on the show today. It's always an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to interview and have them share with us their passion in life's work. And so with that, as you know, we have some incredible PSAs here at Youth for Human Rights International. And so if you have your own PSA you would like to share, you can email it to us at talkabouthumanrights@gmail.com. Also, please make sure to check out our social media platforms. Facebook is Youth for Human Rights California, and our Instagram and Twitter handles are at YHRCAL. Until next time, drop us a line. Thank you.